For a long time, I've been trying to figure out why it's so hard for people to be happy. A few weeks ago, I wrote in my newsletter that our brain has evolved over millions of years to quite literally be our best friend, keeping us alive and looking after our best interests. But if our brain is actually our best friend, and if it's actually looking after our best interests, then shouldn't something like happiness come naturally to us? Since writing that newsletter, I've come to understand that it turns out our brain may not have evolved to become our best friend. At least not in the ways we might think. When we think about our best friend, we think about someone who listens to us, makes us laugh, gives us advice, and is just generally fun to be around. But a lot of the time, our brain is not particularly fun to be around. In fact, it's often quite a downer.
Why are you the way that you are? Honestly, every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way.
I recently read that on average we have about 6,000 thoughts per day, and out of those 6,000 thoughts, about 80% of them are negative. That means our brain generates about 4,800 negative thoughts per day compared to 1,200 neutral or positive ones. And if you're anything like me, hearing that makes you wonder, why the hell would it do that? As usual, JP has the answer for us.
You can be absolutely dead, but there's only so happy you can be.
Until relatively recently, as far as human beings are concerned, we haven't been worried about finding happiness. We've been worried about other, less sexy things like staying alive. Our ancestors spent most of their time finding food and fighting off or avoiding threats, and all it took was overlooking one indication that something was wrong for them to be killed. And that's important because even though those ancestors haven't existed for hundreds of thousands of years, we have a lot more in common with them than we might think. This can be hard to understand because the world looks drastically different today than it did 300,000 years ago. But the truth is, our brain hasn't changed as much as our surroundings have. Evolution is slow, but innovation is rapid. And the reason that's an issue is because it means our brain is stuck using ancient solutions for our modern problems. Nowadays, we don't have to worry about being eaten by a tiger, but we do have to worry about meeting a deadline at work. And because our brain's software system is significantly outdated, it has a tough time telling the difference between these two problems. All it knows is there's a consequence for missing that deadline at work, and as far as it's concerned, this modern day problem is just as much of a threat to our well-being as an ancient one, like stumbling across a tiger that will viciously eat us alive. That might be the worst way to die. What would be worse, being eaten alive or drowning? Let me know. Anyway, what ends up happening is our brain handles each problem the same way. It scans our environment and it imagines what it would be like to experience the worst case scenario so that it can predict the best course of action if that scenario were to come true. So what does all this have to do with happiness? Well, the reason our brain is scanning our environment and imagining the worst case scenarios is because it's wired to keep us alive, not to make us happy. And in order to do so, it has to be highly attuned to the negative things in our environment, because just like Peterson alluded to, all it takes is one negative thing to kill us, but even if we find a million things that make us happy, it doesn't make us any more alive. So in that respect, our brain is less like a best friend and more like a bodyguard or a security system. Now, we could try to make our brain our best friend and try to reprogram it to prioritize happiness, but it doesn't work like a computer, and I imagine we'd find it pretty difficult, if not impossible, to try to override 2 million years of evolution to get our brain to value happiness over survival. However, that doesn't mean that we have zero control. If we want to be happy, first we have to decide that's what we want, and then we have to put the effort in to be able to get it. We have to work for it, just like we have to work for almost everything else that we find valuable. There are tons of books and research papers and other resources out there that can help you find the best practices for you. But having read a lot of those books and those research papers myself, what I can tell you is the most accessible way that I've found to be generally happier on a daily basis is to make a conscious effort to choose what I focus on. A guy named Eric Barker has a perfect analogy for this. He says, "You are not your brain. You are the CEO of your brain. You can't control everything that goes on in Mind Inc., but you can decide which projects get funded with your attention and action." I freaking love this analogy because it brings up two important points. Number one, we are not our brains. We are two separate entities, and it's possible, and maybe even essential, to have a healthy level of detachment from some of the thoughts that our brain has on a daily basis. And this brings up the second point, which is that we can't control which thoughts randomly surface from our subconscious at any given moment, but we can control which ones we pay attention to, or as Barker says, which ones we fund. Because we're separate from our brains, we have agency over which thoughts we choose to focus on. So while we might not be able to completely ignore the 4,800 negative thoughts that we generate every day, we can choose to pay more attention to the 1,200 neutral or positive ones. And when we do that, we'll naturally feel happier as a result. I'm not kidding when I say that this has worked absolute wonders in my life, and honestly, even just the realization that I have complete control over what I direct my attention towards, although sometimes it doesn't actually feel that way, has been a complete game changer for me. It's helped me take responsibility for my own happiness, rather than believing that I'm at the mercy of my ancient brain, or that something is wrong with me if I tend to get hung up on the negatives. If we want to be happy, then the first step is to understand that having a bias towards negativity doesn't mean that something is wrong. It actually means that everything is working just like it should. Our brain is doing its job and keeping us alive. Our brain keeps a business afloat, but if we want it to thrive, it's up to us to make sure that the right projects get funded. If you enjoyed this video, here's a similar one talking about the meaning of life. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. Live your life to the fullest, and I'll see you next time.